I feel fortunate to be introducing our next speaker, Dr. Jordan Kennedy, who's going to be giving a little taste of building like a beaver. So I'm going to pass it over now.
Hi, thank you so much, and apologies for the late start. So I want to do a land acknowledgement of the original caretakers of this land, the Arapaho and the Utes. So I appreciate having the opportunity to speak here on campus today. And I am currently a research fellow at Outer Coast College in Sitka, Alaska. I have my PhD in material science and mechanical engineering from Harvard University. First and foremost, I'm a mechanical engineer. And I was very interested in beavers as a form of biomimicry. And so as part of my PhD studies, I accidentally became a beaver expert in terms of behavior. So I'm really more of an animal behavioralist. I'm a field researcher and experimentalist, and I think I'm trying to brand myself here as a futurist. So the North American beaver, so why did they build? And they build primarily to fulfill a life cycle requirement. And so one of the cool things, well, it's not cool, but one of the opportunities that we had due to driving them to near extinction levels in this country, or on this continent, is we got to see what would happen when they're reintroduced to new habitats. And so they build, if they don't have to build, they won't. So there's this adage, as busy as a beaver. Well, not really. Only if they have to build, they will. And they live in colonies of anywhere from 2 to 10 individuals, and they're a pretty good-sized dog, right? And one of the reasons that beavers are so successful in so many different biomes all over North America is that they're able to modify their environment to suit their life cycle needs. So they like to create these slow-flowing, deep ponds. But even though they're famous for building dams, they build more than just dams. They excavate the ponds out behind the dams to make them wider and deeper. They excavate canal systems to gain access to other aquatic and terrestrial resources. They build lodges which they live in. They clear trail system in which they're able to search and move terrestrial materials. They have their food cache. They don't hibernate. And then they have their scent mounds. They're highly territorial. And all of these features together create a beaver damming complex that is many, many times larger than any individual beaver and consists of many different architectural features, including dams, canals, 1 or 2 lodges, and many trail systems. And in addition to being many, many times larger than any individual beaver, they take many generations to build. So this is satellite imagery from 2003 to 2014 and a drone scan from 2017 that I took. And I'm just plotting the open water. I particularly like this location. When I was first starting my PhD studies, I wanted to find areas to study beavers, and this was a site that was recommended to me. And when I went back there to talk to the rancher, he didn't want to show me because he's like, well, if you do something to hurt those beavers, I'm not going to have water for my cattle. But he let me go back there and look, and I didn't ultimately use this site for my PhD, but one of the things that I like about this imagery is it shows how beavers, not only does it take many generations for beavers to fully realize a beaver damming complex, they can kind of move into an area where there's really nothing, and they can create these aquatic structures. This was a groundwater system until beavers got there and they brought the water up to the surface, which is incredibly important for these grassland high plains ecosystems. So this here is more satellite imagery from Acadia National Park, and I do forgive the satellite for not having a high resolution, but one thing I want you to make note of are the canal systems in this imagery, and they're branching off. And just as I stepped through 1996, 2007, just keep your eyes on the canals, 2011, 2015, 2016, 2019, 2023. And so you can see that this takes many, many years, but one of the things that stands out the most of these beaver-occupied, beaver-modified habitats is the evolution of these canal systems. And so these structures, specifically canals, they're not all created equal when you come to a beaver damming complex. But what they're able to do is they're absolutely massive when you compare them to the whole system, and they interconnect these systems. So even if you have dams in these systems, these canal systems are able to bypass it. But this is a many, many generation process and takes around 30 years for us to naturally realize. And these features have been seen in, Lewis Henry Morgan's work, the original work on the American beaver. And so these structures are very adapted and suited to their landscape. So you have canals, you have multiple dams, you have interconnecting waterways. You have a very heterogeneous distribution, and they're very, very big. I think one of the reasons we have such a hard time seeing it is that when we're standing in it, we're really in it. We can't see the forest through the trees, really, so to speak, because we are in it. These things are so massive. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, and they do this through building. And they're very much, excuse me, they're very much generalists when they come to their building, the excavation, the felling, the clearing, the foraging. And they create a restructured topology and also hydrology, where you have areas of fast flow and slow flow, and that brings in things like many different types of vegetation. And then when you start bringing in all this vegetation and you have these different heterogeneous habitats, you start bringing in many other species, so clams and invertebrates and insects and habitats for birds. And then you start bringing in predators such as fish and bats and amphibians, which brings in even more charismatic predators such as eagles and fox. And then that brings in terrestrial grazers on these big grassland ecosystems, and they want to drink water. And then we have the big charismatic predators that follow afterwards. So in addition to creating this wonderful topology that supports all of these other animals, this food network that develops from this. But there's a few engineering challenges that beavers have, and they have to find and transport building materials. And so one of the ways that they do this, and this was, I think, the most surprising thing for my PhD studies and took me the longest time to grapple with because I was spending too much time looking at the dams and not enough time looking at the other accessory features, were these trail systems and these canal systems, and thinking about how are they making decisions about the landscape that they're navigating, because these are very, very big. They're too big for us to see. It's too big for them to see. Their eyesight isn't even that good. But they're able to make these decisions and repeatedly utilize the same things. And so if these trail systems, they start to turn into beaver slides, and these beaver slides start to turn into canals. And so this is one of the ways that they're communicating through their environment. And so when I started studying beavers, I started with the framework of a robotics lab that was studying termites, and it was studying ants. And one of the reasons they were so interested in termites and ants was for distributed robotics and distributed algorithms. And I had the brilliant idea, which caused me a lot of pain, but I stuck through it, where I'm going to study beavers, and I'm going to figure out how beavers are informed by their environment, and I'm going to have some sort of algorithm. I never got to the algorithm, but I certainly learned a lot about how beavers are informed by their environment, and it was very much informed by this idea of collective robotics, who don't have any, I guess, centralized governance on how they make decisions. And in many ways, beavers are very similar in the sense that it takes many, many generations of beavers to build. And this was a question I was very interested in, was how are they making decisions over many, many generations that look like somebody was in charge? And so then they have another really unique engineering challenge, is they're able to build mechanically robust structures in a relatively high flow environment very, very quickly in a way that is quite enviable. And so when we're thinking about flood situations, one of the things I'm interested in biomimicry is to think about how can we use locally available materials in the environment to build structures very, very quickly in emergency situations. And then there is the distributed robotics, and that's coordinating builders and construction across space and across generations. So up here, I have two pictures. One is a very old drawing imagining how beavers distribute work. And it's around 50 beavers, I think, in the photo, and the longer you look at it, the worse it gets. And they have beavers carrying things on their tails, and they have beavers felling, trees in these little, in a very organized way, in a way that makes sense, especially as humans like to engineer things. And so even though it's not explicitly stated, there's a hypothesis here about how beavers are able to accomplish this massive engineering challenge that they're undertaking on the landscape. So the robots that I have up here, these are called termies, and these were inspired by the way termites build. And it's this idea of stigmergy, where through modifying the environment, you're leaving instructions in the environment to future generations of the same species to know where to build. So if you're a termite and you put a pile of dirt right there, you're telling the next termite that comes along that you too should put a termite or put a pile of dirt there. And so it's a really simple idea that has been theorized for how termites are able to organize and coordinate their building behavior, despite the fact that it takes many, many generations of termites and millions of them to build a termite mound that is many, many times larger than any individual termite. And so this was the same idea, and I was very inspired by this work when thinking about beavers, who have a very similar challenge. Thank you so much. So they also have indirect engineering challenges. They have a heterogeneous hydrology, and they have to stabilize the topography. And so within my sites that I studied, the beaver colonies are the beaver damming complexes that persisted, that did not have their dams wash out in the spring flood. Because in this system that I studied, and I studied it, I chose this location specifically for my thesis work, is because spring flooding washed out the dams every year, and naively I was like, I'm gonna watch a beaver damming complex built from scratch. And that wasn't true by the time it was said and done, but one of the things that I noticed as part of this work is these canal systems, if these were in place, these dams wouldn't fail. And so these canal systems seem to be very important for stabilizing these systems. And I think about them in terms of, well, how would we stabilize our human waterways? Another aspect to it, so these are the two type of colonies that I had throughout my data set. The top one is this beautifully old beaver damming complex. It's probably around 30 to 40 years old. And they have dams in there, and they have canals in there, and it's wonderfully stable, and you don't see beavers engaging in a tremendous amount of building activity because everything's already done. They're just hanging out. And in the bottom, I have a completely different type of hydrology where it's a really narrow stream, and there's beavers occupying it, and they are very, very active builders. And one of the things that they're doing, because they don't really have canals, is they're building these trail systems in order to search for and transport the building materials necessary for their dams, lodges, and food caches. And one of the things that I like to point out here with the way that they're changing the vegetation patterns is that these trail systems are also creating vegetation heterogeneity as well. And so when we're thinking about mimicking ecosystems, particularly in our cities, we could also think about how could we make these little pathways that also promote vegetation heterogeneity. And then and we do have that to a certain extent, right? We've started to implement BDAs as a form of biomimicry on the landscape in order to slow and deepen our waterways. And one of the things that I would like to suggest through my work is that our biomimicry of beavers shouldn't just stop with the beaver dam analogs. It should also extend to these canal systems. And these canal systems, they can be quite small, or they can be absolutely massive, and they connect different waterways. They completely change the vegetation, but they seem to be incredibly important for habitat connectivity, especially aquatic habitat connectivity. And of course, increasing biodiversity. And then, kind of a beaver futurist view, it's not just, damming our rivers and areas, but also thinking about areas where beavers aren't necessarily welcomed or they wouldn't persist, and how can we engineer our cities to be more resistant to flood and be more resistant to drought. And one of the ways to think about that is building like a beaver, right? Having canal systems off of these main waterways in order to compensate for high flow events or low flow events. And the best thing that we could possibly do is partner with keystone species. There's no question about that. But in areas where they would not persist, we should be mimicking these species and learning how to engineer from them. Thank you. I'll take any questions. So I think it's two things, right? So I think the beavers are actively excavating, but I think they're very much aided by the water moving through the system, and they're probably sensing it in a way that we can't really appreciate, right? There's probably more work to be done there. But I think, so one of my hypotheses about this work is I think that they're using the canals as a mechanism of communication between species, like between generations. Like Yeah, so this is like the form of stigmergy, and like where like if if there's a canal here, because trails overgrow every single season, right? And then they get remade every single season, but these canal systems persist on the landscape. And so if you're a beaver navigating a waterway and you're trying to establish a new site, and you come upon a canal, that canal is an indicator to you that at some point in the past, this was a successful spot for another beaver colony. And it's worth investigating for recolonization. And I don't think this is like always true. I think that there's gonna be like a depletion and then a regrowing with like water, like sending sediment in to regrow it. But I mean, I'm not really answering your question because I don't have a good answer.
I'll rephrase the question and then classic academic question I'll add to it. So, sorry for everyone else who wanted to ask other questions. In the absence of Beaver, I'm trying to ask, should we as sort of restoration practitioners be like actively excavating, or can you just sort of, maybe that's what's been
That's my theory. I don't think the water will just do it.
Yeah.
No, because they're actively excavating and they're really changing the way that the water is moving through the system. I mean, like one of my theories about it is that if you want a persistent like system with these BDAs, it should be coupled with the canals, because like the beavers aren't just building a dam; they're building a damming complex that has all of these different architectural elements that work together really well. And so I think that this is like super experimental, but building or excavating a canal in addition to a BDA in order to reinforce that initial effort to have like a go around, and yeah, that's what I think. But that's a big ask of anybody. You?
Yeah, were you able to gain any insight in terms of why and where they put these canals, or did it just seem like, okay, this is an indicator of where they were going to get food, and then they would just follow it?
So in my systems, I had systems that were old that just had a bunch of canals already, right? But then I had other systems where there was no canal or barely any canals at all, and they're building trail systems. And the trail systems, I think, are the precursors to canals, and that the trail systems are very much correlated to where the vegetation is. Like is there woody vegetation here? Right, so I think it comes at its essence down to food. Yeah.
I really appreciate your comment about the canals paired with the BDAs. I did about 10 years of applied research in a large floodplain area in the Columbia River Basin, Lower Columbia. It was tidal freshwater, but there was a levied off portion that was ponded open water, and in a high water year, groundwater would push that up so that it occupied about 250 acres, and in a low water year, that would shrink down to single digit acres, and the beavers were incredibly active on this very clayey soil at the bottom of this lake, and they would dig miles of channels in this very deformable substrate, and they would connect this open water area that was pretty stinky, to be quite honest, full of carp, but they would find all the cold water seeps and springs, and so they weren't just like finding that refuge, they were creating it that other species could use these cold water features.
I noticed that as well, yeah.
Cold water refuge really incredible, and they would dig out kind of pits in those areas and create other ponded areas. So I think there's something to be said about the maturity of a system that has started to accumulate fine sediment enough that they can dig these canals at an extensive scale. So I think there's a sequential nature of the dam building and the sediment accumulation, the networking and building of the dam. So I think there's a sequence of events that happens over time in the maturity of these
systems. Yeah, thanks. I guess you.
They do with the sediment from the canals when they're digging it out.
Yeah, it's. I mean, they'll put it on the side, but it's a flowing system. Like it just gets washed out. So that's the funny thing about how I studied beavers is I never actually saw a single beaver. I used drones to make mappings of the habitats. The first season I tried to go in there and actually I was scaring the beavers off with my scent, right? So I decided that I wasn't going to interact with them at all. On my second field season, I just mapped it and I took flow measurements.
Just one more question. I'm curious if your data set is substantial enough that you could potentially do a networking analysis to decide like how they're making decisions based on their selections, and is there a scent? We know that beavers are really sensitive to scent. Could there be some persistent scent, communication that's happening across generations that's, directing them with this continued?
So castor scents are really ephemeral. They're not going to persist from one season to the next, and they're not. They're constantly adding, right? But they're very strong communicators through smell. And I'm really, the question I was asking is this multi-generational coordination. And in the short term, yeah, there's absolutely scent communication going on, but maybe not at the length scale I'm looking at. Yes. Somebody pick one. I don't. Somebody pick for me.
So some of the other beaver infrastructure elements that seem to persist multi-generationally would be like bank beds and semi-integrated mountain lodges. How do you separate, talking about sort of the attractability of previously infrastructure of the landscape, how do you separate out the attractiveness of canals versus
Right. So the systems that I chose to try to answer this question, those features were washed out in the spring flood. So that's how I was able to make that distinction. Is by the time I was coming around after spring flooding, everything had been washed out, or like all the aquatic structures had been washed out. Where the only thing that's left are the canals. But that's not to say in a densely wooded situation that wouldn't be true.